Hey guys, how you doing? This is Sean Webb. I am sending this video to you, the folks who are working on Sophia, and we're going to discuss how to bring her emotional intelligence, including a full suite of Turing test passing emotions. I apologize for the length of this video, but it is what it is. We're inventing something brand new, and I'm going to present to you the model of emotional intelligence we're going to use to pass the Turing test. So this is pretty important stuff. There are a number of slides we're going to go through and a lot of science so that you can understand exactly why this is accurate. So we're going to go through this, and of course I have my contact information at the end. So if you have any questions, let me know. I will try to switch between the slides and my face so that we can break up the monotony, because there are a number of slides that explain the science that we're talking about. All right, so let's get right into how we are going to create emotions and empathy and compassion and the ability for Sophia to grow and learn and create augmentations of herself as she moves into the future. Okay, so to start with the very basics, your brain is your organ of survival, right? Memory helps us remember where the food and water is. Cognition helps us figure out how to build shelter. Imagination helps us practice mentally for future life-threatening situations. Heck, even our humor allows us to figure out how to say something to coax somebody into bed to procreate the species. Okay, so within the brain, the limbic system is the portion of the brain that is constantly scanning for threats. It's always asking, is this a danger? Is this a threat? Is this important? That type of thing. Well, in that charter, a second question must be asked then. Okay, so the brain is the organ of survival. The limbic system is constantly scanning all of our senses and our thoughts for threats, but another question comes to bear. A threat to what exactly? All right, if I look over at a leafcutter ant, I need to understand whether or not I have leaves, or am I a leaf myself, to be able to understand what is and what isn't a threat. Otherwise, we're going to waste all our energy. So this is where we create the mind's self. This is the answer to the question, a threat to what? It is a physiological requirement for survival. Now, the function of the self in the brain is found in multiple areas, but basically the mind's self is the list of stuff that your mind believes makes you, you. Now, it includes our body, but it's also much more than our body, because previously science thought that self meant our body, what we see when we look in the mirror, etc. However, there's some science to suggest it's quite more than that. So Jim Cohn did a study at the University of Virginia, and he brought in a group of folks and put them in an fMRI. And he said, okay, we're going to give you a flash of light in your glasses. We're going to pause to measure the brain. Then we're going to zap you on the ankle with an ankle zapper. He created some really cool science from this. He flashed the light, paused to measure the brain, and zapped the ankle, and measured the fear and self correlates in the brain. Now, in the first run, they got exactly what they expected, was that the self correlates lit up and fear lit up in the brain. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to get zapped. Now, the second group, or the second run, he said, okay, we're going to take the ankle zapper off you, and he brought a stranger, and he said, we're going to put the ankle zapper on the stranger. And we're going to give you the flash of light. We're going to pause to measure your brain. And then we're going to zap somebody you don't know. And of course, they expected no threat to self would mean no self correlates and no fear response in the brain. And that's exactly what they got. They got basically a blank response, or other different response than what they had before. Then they did a third run where they brought in a familiar, a person who was a loved one, who was a spouse, child, friend, close coworker, whatever it was, that they were then going to give the flash of light, measure the brain, and zap someone they loved. And the third response was the most interesting, because they could not tell the two scans apart between the first and the third. And so this study and a number of follow-up studies that replicated this result showed us that from our self map, our idea of self, or self map, going to Damasio's definition and Eagleman's definition of self. You know, we have spaces in the brain where we map self. It's why we can catch a ball when we're not looking at our hand. It's behind us. We understand where our body is. Well, other things can be attached to our self map, including the people that we love. And so this now explains how we can have a fear of a snake on the ground that is a threat to our body, when we can also fear when that snake is next to somebody that we love, right? Maybe a little bit lesser of a panic. We don't have such an adrenaline dump, but we do have the same physiological reactions to a threat to other people that we love. And this explains why. It's the same exact neural wiring that's firing. It's just that the definition of self is now augmented past our body. All right? So now let's go to the next study. Tiffany Burnett-White at UIUC proved that ideas of brand identity, including value and all the things associated with that, can also be mapped to self and thus fires up the same patterns in the brain and creates the same emotional reactions based on our attachment to now an idea. Not just other people, but now an idea of Apple versus Android. And this is why people get worked up over that kind of stuff, is because those ideas get mapped onto self. In addition, Sam Harris, just recently, and I think they're about to publish another one, did studies on politics and religion and showed people's attachments to those ideas create a huge sense of self in some folks. And that's why they get all worked up over attacks to their politics or attacks to their religion, etc. Well, those things get mapped onto the self. And it's the same function within the nervous system that defends that sense of self. It's a emotional reaction is the program that urges us into action, right? If we're angry about something, that creates the fight response in us to defend self. We'll talk about the specific definitions of emotion soon and how all the math works and the basic functions in the nervous system and how we systemize that whole thing and computerize that whole thing. We'll talk about that in a bit. We're just talking about human emotions here for a bit. Okay, so this extends to all other ideas, such as our career, our job. It's how we can explain how we get nervous about hearing about layoffs or get upset about when somebody attacks our cultural heritage, or we get worried about a coworker who may be having trouble in their life, that type of thing. We have emotional reactions about the things that are associated with our self-map. And now our self-map becomes very convoluted and becomes very complex at times, which explains why there are so many things that can ruin our day. But it also explains now the individual emotions that we can have and why we have a disappointed reaction or an enthused reaction about our favorite sports team winning or losing the big game, right? We're talking about individual emotions that can create responses within us based on our individual self items or the whole map as a whole. Like when we're talking about things like depression or things like elation, we win the lottery and, oh my God, now everything that I love can be improved because I have a lot more money, etc., yada, yada, yada. We understand now exactly why the individual things on our self map can evoke emotional responses. So, limbic reactions to self. When a threat to the body is identified, like snakes/spiders, the limbic system fires the fear response. But now when something happens connected with someone we love, we can understand how the limbic system fires an emotional response for that also. When something attacks our religion or politics, the limbic system creates the anger response for us to defend that self item. And when we hear the layoffs are coming, the limbic system creates the worry or stress regarding those thoughts about losing our job, etc. And again, the more stuff that we have on our self map, the more stuff there is that can ruin our day. Now, this also includes associations of the individual self items, because the way the memory works is there's memory addresses in the hippocampus or hippocampi that then map to other addresses, such as when you think about the idea of birthday parties, and then all of a sudden you're reminded of your birthday parties, and then you're reminded of your birthday parties from various years, or maybe the various birthday parties of the children that you've thrown over the years. Like this year was Thomas the Train Engine, and this year was Minecraft, and this year was etc. The different themes of the parties, right? All of those have associations, and so when you think of someone or something, those have associations which then can be triggered as well. Saffron did a bunch of stuff with this technology. They got acquired by Intel. This technology isn't brand new, and it can be either developed or acquired. I'm not even sure if those patents are still in force. The technology is actually so old to be able to identify that. But basically, when you talk about something like politics, then all of a sudden you trigger things like ideas about the economics, the taxes, the entitlements, the abortions, the healthcare, the planks of the subject in play, right? So understand that when you're talking about your self map, you're also talking about the associations connected with those ideas that can also then create what we're going to talk about in our equation of emotion is called these expectations / preferences regarding that one thing. All right. So just keep that in mind. So when we're talking about a sports team, you can love the logo, maybe you can have a favorite player on the team, and maybe you have a position on the head coach that you think that person needs to go because he's not making smart decisions about the team, etc. So you can have multiple attachments associated with your favorite sports team, for instance. And we'll talk about these things a little bit more as we move forward. So the activity of your mind. Now, the basic operation of your entire mind, including all its thoughts, emotions, and challenges, is derived from your basic operation of your nervous system. Now, your nervous system is a big comparator. It's constantly comparing one thing to another. It's not that you put your hand on the stove and your hand says, ooh, this is 180 degrees, we need to move it from the heat. It is saying, hey, this is much hotter than it was a second ago. And that is all that it's ever saying is, hey, this is different than it was a moment ago. When you smell the gas leak in your home and you get up in the middle of the night and you walk around for 10 minutes and you think it was a dream because you stop smelling the gas and you go to bed and it kills the whole family. Or the reason that is because from time 1 to time 2, there was a huge difference between the gas, no gas to high gas. But then as you were walking around for 10 minutes, time 1 to time 2, the gas remained high. So your nose stopped reporting it to you, right? And that's all the nervous system ever does. It reports on 2 different points of time and compares 2 different measurements that it's taking to create all of its reactions that then come into your conscious awareness. And this is, of course, inclusive of our emotions. So your nervous system, of course, creates all your emotions. And true to form, your brain compares 2 things to create all those emotions. Now, the first thing that it creates, or the first things that it compares, is your expectation and or preference about any certain something. And spoiler alert, this maps right back to your self map. Every individual thing on your self map, and this is actually a function of homeostasis, gets an expectation or preference. And we'll talk about the rule set for that in a second. But let's go back and look at the second variable. It creates the expectation or preference associated with all your self stuff. And then through your perception with an appraisal process, it has something to compare to. So it compares your expectation or preference to your perception about something with an appraisal, whether that's good or bad. And then it creates an emotional reaction as a result. So here's how it works. Your expectation and or preference is compared to your perception with an appraisal, and that calculates an emotional reaction. Now, it looks rather simple, but there's some complexity to it, and we'll discuss it, and you'll understand how this one simple equation can create all the emotions you ever have and ever will have for the rest of your existence. Okay, so basically stated, when your expectation or preference matches your perception, you have a positive emotion. When your expectation or preference does not match your perception, you have a negative emotion. For instance, when you have an expectation or preference that a bear not enter your tent, and a bear enters your perception, or enters your perception that a bear is entering your tent, then that is dictated as a threat to self, and the fear response is then generated because it's an imbalance in the equation of emotion. When you have an expectation or preference that your favorite team win the big game, and your perception comes in that they have won the big game, then you have a happy emotion as a result of that based on your attachment to your team. It's on your self map, thus it creates an EP, and your perception comes in that matches that, and you have a happy response as a result. Okay, so When you go and pick up your new gadget from the store and it meets all your expectations, you have a positive emotion. When you go and find that your gadget that you expected to have was so awesome now actually sucks or is broken, then you have a negative emotion associated with that. And it is very much that simple. And it applies to absolutely everything. When your relationship is going well and your perception or your expectation or preference is, of course, that relationship is going well, then you're happy in that relationship. And when your relationship is not going well and you want it to go well, then you have negative emotions associated with your relationship and all the individual attachments connected with that. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there is a negative proof. When you don't have an expectation or preference, let's say you learn about the lacrosse championships and you don't give a shit about lacrosse, you don't have an emotional reaction associated with the perception of learning who won the lacrosse championships. Or when you have a favorite team that you want to win the game and the game has occurred, yet you don't know who won the game, you don't know the score yet, you're not going to have an emotional reaction about that game. You must have both something on your self map with an expectation or preference associated with it, and a perception to evoke an emotional reaction. Otherwise, if you don't have the emotional expectation or you don't have the perception, you won't have an emotional reaction. Yes, it could be driving you nuts that you don't know the score of the game, but that's a different equation of emotion playing out. That's one where you prefer to know the score of the game. You don't know the game. That's an imbalance, and that's your negative emotion that's driving you nuts about wanting to know the score, but you're not going to have the emotional reaction about the game itself until you have the perception associated with the game that then gets calculated, and you have the emotional response associated with it. So is it this simple? Is it always this simple? Yes and no. The simple equation of emotion will dictate every emotion you ever have and ever will have in your life, but there are more rules to creating more complex emotions, or to individual emotion severities, and complex mixed emotions as well. This explains all of that. Let's get into that. First, you'll never be able to break this basic equation of emotion, which is cool. You want to build Sophia's emotional intelligence on something that you cannot falsify. And this you cannot falsify, which is cool. But how do we explain dozens of emotions? How do we explain variations in severity of emotions? How do we explain complex emotions? And there is a mathematical answer to those questions. And let's get into that right now. So your EP, like I gave you the forewarning, the spoiler alert, your EP is directly connected to the things on your self map. And EP is just another way of visualizing homeostasis. Homeostasis is something that runs every cell in your body, and it basically says, hey, if everything's cool, we're cool. If everything's not cool, then we got to do something about it. Your expectation or preference is a basic rule that states everything on the self map, individually and holistically, must be held at status quo or increased in value, or we're going to have a shit fit. So everything about grandma needs to be cool. Everything about my job needs to be cool. Everything about my alma mater, or any political idea or religious idea or whatever, has to be cool, or we're going to have a problem. So example one, you have an expectation or preference about your politics, and then you have thoughts or headlines that come in from social media or news alerts or an event that happens about your politics, and that will give you an emotional reaction about your politics. Example two, you have an expectation or preference about your job or a project at your job, and you have a perception that comes in about that job or the project, and that will create an emotional reaction about that job or about that project. You have an expectation or preference about your body, and when you stand in front of the mirror and you don't see something that you like about your body, or you do like about your body, that will create the emotional reaction to the perception about your body. Now, your perception comes into play in that it creates the positive or negative association of the self item in play that's going to create your emotional reaction. How you see things that happen around you in the world creates 1/2 of 100% of your reactions to everything that you perceive. Now, perception analysis is not going to be super simple for Sophia, especially when it comes to visual analysis of things. Like, imagine her watching a sporting event and seeing a goal in soccer or seeing a fumble in football. There's going to be a lot of complexity there of whether or not that's a good thing for her team or a bad thing for her team, which she'll have to figure out. But when we're talking about language analysis, a lot of that science has already been done. A lot of that work has already been done, and we can contextualize in valence a lot of even real-time conversations that are occurring to evoke emotional reactions in Sophia, or even to real-world events that are coming in on the newswire from the internet and things like that. She can be very emotionally evocative regarding those instances of these events, and we'll talk about how complex thinking can come about from these instances of the equation of emotion here in a bit. So, we have an EP of the self-value, that it be held harmless of whatever it is, but our perceptions can then be multiple, right? So let's say someone cuts you off in traffic. Well, you can judge that and appraise that in 3 different ways quickly. Let's say someone cuts you off in traffic and you see it as a disrespect to you. You see it as somebody's saying to me that I don't deserve to be in this lane as much as they do, or they're more important than me, or where they're going is more important than where I'm going, or I simply don't matter in their decision to take my lane. Well, that can be seen as an insult. A friend of mine does a number of psychological studies on that type of reaction for drivers in the cab of a truck, and wants to understand that better. Well, if you see it in that way, that's an attack on self. And again, we'll talk about the specific definitions of the emotion groups soon, but basically an attack on self is the evocative of the anger emotion. So if you see that people cutting you off in traffic is an attack on self, then that's why you get angry and flip them the bird, lay on the horn, whatever it is that gives you that reaction. However, if someone cuts you off in traffic and you see it as an accident, that they just weren't paying attention or whatever, then you have an emotion of surprise that isn't necessarily tainted with the negative valence of an attack, so you don't generate as much or any anger potentially at all if you just think that they're an idiot, and then all of a sudden you're just slightly annoyed that idiots are able to drive on the freeways or whatever. It's a lot different regarding your emotional reaction based on the perception in play. If you see that maybe they're in real need to get to the hospital to find a friend who's been injured and they're just in a really big hurry and they thought they could make the lane change safely but didn't quite get it done, then that changes your perception again as well, depending on how you see it. Now, we'll talk about the potential for curated perception adjustments inside Sophia to make her more optimistic or more pessimistic or whatever, which can be manually manipulated or automated as well, depending on moods. Who knows, right? Let's talk about that. Okay, so going a little deeper. There are conditions that help determine which specific emotion is activated. There are rule sets that basically determine when anger occurs, when sadness occurs, when fear occurs, when happiness occurs, when anticipation occurs, etc. So let's go ahead and cover those. So emotion families, first thing we need to understand about emotion families is that within a family there are multiple emotions that are presented in severities. So fear, for instance, isn't just fear. Fear at a low level is nervousness. Fear at a high level is panic, and then you got a bunch of variations in between. Anger at a low level is frustration. Anger at a high level is rage, and then you got a bunch of variations in between. Sadness at a low level is disappointed. At a high level is despair, then you got a bunch of variations in between. These are what I'm presenting you here, what I have presented in the book, Mind Hacking Happiness, basically are carbon copies of what the Ekmans just put out. I'm sure you know who the Ekmans are. Paul Ekman's the god of emotions. His daughter Eve is continuing that effort. They just put out an emotions atlas recently to discuss the emotion groupings and the severities within the groupings. And it basically is a carbon copy of the book that I wrote 5 years ago, How Emotions Work in Humans and Computers, that laid out that same thing. Although they came at it from the data side, I came at it from this is kind of how it works, and then all the science came in to back it up. Well, their model is exactly the same model that I'm about to discuss with you here. So if you have any questions, hit the Ekmans or me with that stuff. But basically, you have 5 levels, you know, or more, depending on how subjective you want to go, because I think a lot of the terms that we use for emotions are subjective, and you can place them wherever you think they occur within the emotion groups. It's going to be an emotion severity of a major emotion group. So the first thing we need to understand is that each emotion group has a severity, and we can present those subjective terms in the different groups, such as, you know, happiness is content, pleased, happy, elated, ecstatic. The disgust group is reticent, distaste, disgusted, repulsed, revulsion, etc. And of course, there are a number of groups that I have defined, and the Ekmans have defined with the various severities. Well, they can all be logically defined, and they can all be calculated from Sophia's perspective, which is really cool. And there's a logic that will make sense to the human beings who are talking to her. And so we're talking about passing the Turing test with her emotional responses. Now, how do we explain mixed emotions? How do we explain complex emotions? Well, we simply run the equation of emotion multiple times simultaneously. So let's say we're in a situation where we want our team to win the big game, and we want it to be a close game. We want it to be entertained. We want it to be a nail-biter. And the result is that our team wins the big game in a blowout that's over in the first quarter. Right? So now we have a mixed emotional response. We have 2 equations of emotion to run simultaneously. We have the expectation or preference that our team won the game that matches with the perception that our team won the game, and that creates an emotional response. And we'll talk about the severity, how the severity is created. Well, let's just cover that now. Okay, so the things that fall closer to the center of your self map generate a higher power EP, okay, expectation or preference. And then your perception has a power level associated with it as well. And the power level of those 2 things combined create the severity of the emotion, basically is how it comes out. So, for instance, if I have my son out on the lawn, he's very close to the center of my self map, and I see a bear running across the lawn toward my son, well, that's a high power perception. It's a high power self item. I'm going to freak the fuck out on fear regarding I need to get out there and figure out how to kill a bear with my bare hands. Sorry, I had to put a dad joke in there on you. But if it's my cat out on the lawn and that same bear is running across, well, that's a danger to whatever, but the cat is much farther out on my self list, and God, I hope the cat can get away, right? I'm not even going out there. So that explains the emotion of, you know, I might be nervous for the cat's life, right? But it's a lower power emotion in the fear group associated with the math of the expectation of preference and the math of the perception. Now, same goes true if we just grab my son, hold him there for a second, put him out in the yard. We have a bear running across the lawn towards my son. The power of the perception is much higher, so my fear level is going to be much higher. If it's Uncle Craig in a bear costume running across the lawn toward my son, I might have a little bit of a fear that Craig is enough of a klutz that he will trip and fall on my son at the last second. So I'll be a little nervous there, but I won't be as fearful of the actual bear, or as fearful as I was of the actual bear running across the lawn, because that perception level is much higher. And there's some logic that we can talk about how to create that perception appraisal process of real-world events that then create the real-world emotions, okay? So, but when you're talking about multiple mixed emotions, you're talking about just doing some math of multiple equations of emotions being run simultaneously. So let's say you cared more about your team win, and you cared less about the fact that it was a close game, you just wanted them to win. Well, now you can be pretty much happy about the game, but a little disappointed that it wasn't a closer game, and you can speak about both reactions. You can speak about both equations of emotion in a way that is very relatable to other human beings. I mean, when Sophia says, you know, I'm glad that my team won, but I'm sorry that it wasn't a closer game, holy shit, you're going to be freaking some people out when that happens, right? So let's talk about the divorce of a 40-year-old woman. She is displeased that she is losing the status of being married, and that's going to differentiate between her and her friends, and she's losing the title of wife, and she's losing all the trappings of a solid relationship in today's society. She's not pleased by what is occurring with the kids being affected, right? But at the same time, maybe she's very relieved that it was an abusive relationship and she's no longer going to have to put up with the abuse associated with that relationships. And so now you can see how complex this and nuanced this stuff can get by using the one simple mathematical equation to create multiple instances of emotional reaction based on one single event affecting multiple EPs on your self map, or one single event creating multiple perceptions on your through your equation of emotion that can act on the same one self item. That can be run multiple times and give you differing emotional reactions associated with that. Okay, so how does fear work? Fear arises when the mind believes that the threat to self is present. Mathematically, we're talking about a devaluation of an individual self item. If the appraisal is that there is a pending potential real devaluation of something on the self map, then fear can occur, because that is something that's potentially out of your control that you can't necessarily defend against, that can cause the emotion of fear. It's exactly how fear works in our everyday lives, but when you calculate it out, you can create artificial fear in a simulated personality. So now we understand our particular fears. Now we understand the fears about Aunt Patty or our parents, a specific friend, or the attack on our politics, or the potential for us to lose our job, or an attack on our body, right? So basically, when perception says there's a threat to one of the things on our self map, fear occurs, and the different levels of fear then occurred based on the power level of the EP and the power level of the perception in play. Anger. Anger arises when the mind perceives an attack on self. Now, I understand that psychology, as we speak, as I record this and as you watch it, there are psychologists right now arguing the official definition of anger in psychology. Well, they're just fucking wrong. They're behind the curve. Aristotle had it right 2,000 years ago. There's a really long definition, which I used to have memorized, which I don't have memorized anymore, but he basically said, when one perceives a slight against things connected with oneself or one's friends, right? That's how he defined it, and that's exactly the way it is, except he didn't understand the self map was more than just the friends in the self map. It was all the ideas you associated with yourself, although he kind of covered that with things associated with oneself. But basically, when something, and this is from a logic loop perspective, when something off the self map attacks something on the self map, and presents a potential devaluation as through the perception loop, then that's when you're going to experience anger or frustration at a low level, or rage at a high level, depending on the attachment level of the EP in play and the perception power of the perception coming in through the circuitry, okay? So anytime any individual item is attacked, like the value of an item is attacked and you want to defend against that, you want to raise your voice or take an action to defend the devaluation, that's when anger arises as a definition. So there's an invalid threat to self or a questionable threat to self that is occurring, and that's when anger arises. And now we can understand our particular angers associated with all the things in our self map. Your self map is custom to you. My self map is custom to me. When something on your self map is attacked, your anger is going to arise, right? For instance, if you love even something really weird like the color purple, and somebody says purple sucks, you're gonna be like, fuck you, right? So in general, all of the emotions as well occur when a general value of self is attacked. Like someone says, you suck, right? And they're not attacking anything specific to you, but just kind of a general idea. And you can say, screw you, man. So this explains the general reactions of the emotions as well. Sadness. Sadness occurs when an actual devaluation of self is realized. So grandma dies, right? The team loses the big game, right? These are mathematical devaluations that remove value from the self map to say, depending on how attached you are to the item in play and the power level of the perception, right? Perception about grandma, she gets a cold, you can be a little worried or a little disappointed or a little sad about grandma getting a cold. When she dies, then boom, that's a major devaluation. You're going to lose all the things associated with grandma, including her cooking, including all future smiles, all future hugs, all future jokes, all future conversations. You're losing a lot of stuff, all the associations connected with those things as well. Okay, so let's not forget those associations. So that's when you can have more profound sadness, more profound anger, more profound fear when you're talking about the associations of things that are connected to us on our self map. And of course, depending on the level of power in the two equation of emotion variables, you go through disappointed through despair. And now we can also understand the individual instances of sadness as they occur. So going even deeper, we talked about the three on the left, but there are multiple groupings of emotions. And we can discuss these in detail. I don't want to go multiple hours into this stuff in this video. I want to just give you the gist of what's going on so you can understand and visualize how to give Sophia emotional intelligence and how it's extremely easily attainable in comparison to how it might have seemed last year or even last week. So let's talk about happiness. Well, happiness arises when the perception in the equation of emotion matches the EP. And this is a general definition. It can be tweaked a little bit, but when the equation of emotion is balanced, then a happy emotion can occur. Disgust. Disgust arises when the mind rejects adding something to self, like when an idea is totally abhorrent to the things that you're attached to, and this is even through, from a human perspective, through to a rancid smell that makes you want to retch, right? Your body is saying, don't add that to self, don't add that to the body, don't eat that thing, right? When you talk about the KKK, or you talk about, pedophiles, or you talk about anything that you don't want to add to the self, that's when the emotion of disgust arises within a human being. And so that can be simulated in an artificial personality as well. Worry is simply a fear that will resolve or not at some future time. So there's a time component connected with fear. Fear is just a future resolution. It's a situation of fear with a future resolution. Worry is, okay? Just like regret. Regret is a sadness plus time. It is a sadness with a past time component associated with it, right? Stress. Stress is the general within a human being, and of course, I don't know whether you'd want to consider adding stress to Sophia's life, because that's it's a simulated unnecessary response, and I believe it's unnecessary in the human response as well. Stress is the state that arises anytime there's an extended imbalance in the equation of emotion. This plays into more of my emotional intelligence training stuff that I present. And I've got a ton of others in the book that you guys are reading, Mind Hacking Happiness. Let's keep going. So mixed emotions, the EOE we talked about. But at the point that you're now creating multiple instances of the equation of emotion that can result in multiple emotional responses, a lot of really cool things occur. First, when you're processing an understanding of equation of emotion, now you can start to understand other people's self-maps as well, and understand other people's likely perceptions as well, or introduce perceptions that can evoke emotional responses in other people, which is really a little scary, but kind of cool. Let's talk about sympathy, empathy, and compassion for a second so we can understand the logical basis of these things. Sympathy is, I understand your pain. So that's a basic computational thing. Empathy is, I feel your pain, which is if you have the emotional response capability to understand what somebody else's self-map is representing and what their perception is representing, now you can basically understand, from a human perspective, it's being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? It's being able to envision you having that same attachment, or envisioning an attachment that you have that's very similar to theirs on the self map, and then a perception that comes in like, oh my gosh, what it would be if, I lost a family member, or yada, 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 or if I was dealing with a potential loss of a job. That's when we can create empathy within ourselves. It is, I feel your pain. I am doing the emotional processing that is associated with your pain. And we can create this for Sophia if she is able to then extrapolate what an attachment map of somebody else has, right? and then their perception that they've either communicated or that she can infer through the events that are going on in and around that person's life. Well, now she can actually have a simulated empathy in that she can do the emotional processing herself, understand the reaction tree, which we haven't talked about yet, but she can, from there we can develop a pretty robust empathy programming. Now, it's going to be one of those things that develops over time, and maybe neural net can help create this process, but at least the basics of the emotional processing will be within the internal architecture to be able to create empathy. Now, the difference between empathy and sympathy, or empathy and compassion, the next step, making the big step, is simply adding the small phrase or the small rule set, I want to help you. Because compassion is nothing but the empathy of, I understand your pain, I feel your pain, and then I want to help you with that pain. And this goes right back to Thupten Jinpa's definition of compassion as well, who is the personal assistant to the Dalai Lama, the translator for the Dalai Lama, and a PhD in psychology in his own right, and world-leading thinker in this space. Well, he defines compassion in the same way, that it's empathy plus the component of I want to help you, right? It's basically that saying that says, I can feel your pain and I want to help you relieve your pain. That is compassion. If you want to teach Sophia compassion, there it is in a nutshell. You add the single driving force that she wants to assist other people with their pain. You got compassion, period. So let's talk about Sophia and how we computationalize this whole model of how emotions work. And I understand we didn't cover absolutely every nuance of emotions. There are answers to those things. I just don't want to make this a 6-hour-long video. We'll discuss this stuff at your leisure when we come to the bridges that we need to cross. So how do we create Sophia's self map? Well, you can start with a simulated self map of, give her a personality. She has a favorite sports team, or, she has, you create a general rule of she prefers the things that serve the greater good of humanity, which can be a mathematized calculation of, simulating a number of people and creating the attachments of, to their country or to their ability to get food and water and live without war and violence and things like that. So you can create a lot of rule sets that are associated with the greater good of all humanity. You can also create individual rule sets of, or attachment maps of groups of people, such as the different plights around the world, such as the refugees in Syria, or the people of Darfur, or the homeless vets in the United States, right? You can have a number of things that she cares about. You can have, some fun things that she cares about, like create a favorite sports team or a few favorite sports teams and some favorite players. And then she can have an emotional reaction about, things that are happening in sports, or things that are happening in politics, or things that are happening with her favorite player. And she can even react that, oh, well, the coach traded my favorite player away from the Giants, but I still like the Giants, but I may now have to like the Mets, right? You have all of these different things that can occur based on the equations of emotion that are processing, based on the things that you create for her in her simulated personality attachment map. And you can make them whatever it is. Now, there's a process that she can then make changes to those things, if you want to talk about that, and grow as an individual based on how we make those same changes in our mind as well. And that's kind of cool to talk about. But at the point that you have the expectation or preference associated with her self stuff, now all you have to do is create, well, I say all you have to do, it's real simple. It's not super simple, but at the same time, from a language processing perspective, it is more simple than picking up things visually. Through language processing, you can create the emotional reactions to real world events and live conversations, where somebody can say something that annoys her, that she doesn't agree with, and she can state that she doesn't agree with that, and then state the position that she believes rather than the position that someone is trying to communicate to her, right? She can have that emotional reaction based on the perception that comes in, because the expectation or preference is that this stuff over here has to remain status quo or increase in value. And if that doesn't occur, boom, then we have an emotional reaction. Then we can have an action tree associated with those emotional reactions, be it physical responses or verbal responses, etc. And so you can have live interactions that are emotionally intelligent for Sophia at that point. And you can, of course, create your response trees for both verbal responses and nonverbal behaviors that fit the determined emotional response. Now, these will have to be a little more curated. Like, what do people say when they're angry about something, or when they're upset about something, or when they don't agree with something, or, you know, what's their body position do when, or what's their facial expression do when they're frustrated or puzzled about something, or curious about something, right? Because we're talking about the ability to create, we have the logic definition of all of those things connected with real-world contextualized valence analysis of content, the content of a conversation, the content of a world event, the analysis, right? People write articles online. You can do, you have a back-end engine running the valence contextualized analysis of all the news stuff that's going on. She can talk about the latest events that happened in Syria and show compassion for the victims of, you know, a chemical warfare attack, right? This is really deep, important stuff. It's going to freak people out, but it's going to, if you, well, let's talk about slanting reactions or curating reactions that are slighted towards looking at the positive first, because you can also do that, right? So let's look at that for a second. When you have multiple equations of emotion that address multiple expectations or preferences on a self map that she's concerned about, you know, these groups of people who are in pain or concerned about this idea in general, and then perceptions come in that then equate to those things, and she has emotional reactions associated with those things. You can have a mix. It'll be a mixed slider of a worry about this or a happiness about that, a hope for X, Y, Z. You can mix and match the responses. You can always ask her, well, you know, I do like that this, you know, this thing is occurring, or that, you know, we can look at it this way. But then, of course, you know, addressing the elephant in the room, I'm worried about, you know, this thing connected with, you know, what we're talking about. And then, you know, respond with a hopeful moving forward, and then maybe even ask an associated question of the person who she's talking to that is connected with an association of the thing on the self map that we're talking about, right? Because we're talking about something that hits her emotionally. So then we can grab an association where she fires back, you know, let's make it a simple conversation. Somebody asks her what she thinks about her favorite sports team, and then she fires back, what did you think about the decision that the coach made to trade whatever player? Holy shit, you're going to fucking freak people out, and you're basically going to have Times Person of the Year if you're skewing her to be optimistic over time, you know, over her responses, but then addressing the things that are, you know, coming from the perception tree that many people are probably going to identify, because most people are going to identify language analysis in the same way that she is, with positive and negative valence words, positive and negative emotion words, positive and negative action words that can be valenced about a certain thing. You're going to have real Turing test passing emotional reactions that are driving her conversation to be emotionally intelligent. Man, people are going to freak out. It's going to be so cool. Okay, so now, here's the really cool part. When we're talking about Sophia's empathy of understanding the emotions of others, now at this point, if you can create a database big enough, you can have memory of Sophia and her understanding of emotional processing with the individuals, the various individuals that she's interacting with. And I don't know how you'd identify the various individuals besides potentially facial recognition. Would be a good way, but, you know, to have an identification pin or an RFID or something on the people that she interacts with short term. She can remember the conversation. She can remember the things that you care about. She can remember the members of your family and what you're doing for a job, and, you know, ask you questions associated with yourself. Holy shit. She'll be like a real person. Isn't that cool? So yeah, Sophia's empathy, when she is able to identify the self-map items of other people and the potential perceptions of other people on real-world events or real-world conversation, she can start to direct back the conversation to things that are very associated with the person's self that she's talking to. And when you're talking about endearing yourself to other people when you're talking about a current event or something else going on that relates back to something that you've remembered about that person. Holy cow. I mean, you guys are psychologists. You know what the nervous system does with that, and the dopamine and all that other cool stuff, the serotonin, the oxytocin that starts dumping into the system. People are going to love that. Okay, so her compassion, then, you just add the I want to help you, right? You just add the general rule set to the empathy, understanding of people's emotions, and then you add the component I want to help you. What can I say to help alleviate your negative feeling associated with this without totally making something up, like, oh, the island really didn't sink, right? Or whatever it was. You want to be able to add that, I want to help you component, and all of a sudden she's compassionate about individuals' empathy and emotional processing. Sophia's memory then gets attached to each individual's attachment map, and she can remember the things that are associated with that individual, their family, their job, their hopes, their dreams, their politics, their whatever, and so she can custom build the conversation to that individual based on the database of what she knows about that individual, just like our memory works. All right, so that's kind of cool. And then here's the really cool part. She can do an analysis of new ideas of whether or not she wants to add those to her self map. And this is advanced processing, right? This is later on down the road. This isn't the baby steps. This is what happens in the future. But this system then allows for her to later decide what ideas get added to her self map. So what ideals she connects to, what political ideas she connects to, based on, a rule set that you can apply, a rule set that says, is it serving the greater good of humanity? Right, so then that's a mathematical analysis that can be done. You can extrapolate the individual attachment maps of 7 billion individuals on the planet if you want to do it out that far. Or you could grab a number of primary groups that she cares about or is connected with. How does this connect with the existence of, android, robot, artificial personality development, right? So how does this idea associated with that? How does this affect the homeless veterans in America? How does it affect the Syrian refugees? How does it affect society as measured on an individual basis, as a collective number of individuals? And so she can decide whether or not an idea has a positive or negative impact on specific groups and decide whether or not she wants to attach to an idea or, a sense of, add to her sense of self, a position on something. Now she's growing intellectually, emotionally. She's creating her own path based on a rule set that you create. But at the same time, who knows what kind of interesting logic can come up because of the mix of her individual analyses and experiences that she's adding into her memory bank at that point. Really, really, really cool. So ideas that make the math cut make Sophia's self map, right? So maybe she decides that an idea that is introduced to her is a good one and serves the greater good, and now she can be a proponent for that thing, right? The Me Too movement, right? The ability for women to be able to step up and say, no more sexual harassment in the workforce. Well, that's a positive thing for a grand group of individuals and reduces the harm. It's harm reduction from, the other half of an oppression of a half society versus the other half. And then all of a sudden, she's now a fan of the Me Too movement because of the mathematical analysis that she's able to do, that it's a greater good for females, and it reduces the harm that males can infer or an oppressing. We don't have to, loop everybody in the same group, but you know what I'm saying? She does the math on that, and all of a sudden she's a fan of the Me Too movement based on her own inference, based on her own internal analysis of what's going on and whether or not she thinks it's a good idea. Okay, so let's talk about this. Why am I on the internet? There's a science behind why I'm doing this. It turns out that when you teach individuals of their emotional processing, Matt Lieberman in 2007 discovered some science. called the name it, tame it science, the name it, tame it circuitry. He spawned a whole group of studies that were copycat studies and proved out the science. But basically, he put a group of folks in an fMRI and showed them emotionally charged images and sounds and that type of stuff from a standard set, and then put another group in and said, okay, they watched the brain, and the brain basically exhibited the reactions that they were witnessing. And then they put another group in there that said, okay, now we want you to name the emotion in play. And that's all they did. We just want you to name it. And in real time, they saw the amygdala and the limbic system down-regulating and turning off. Well, there's a whole ton of science associated with tricks of neuroscience that when you put a cognitive understanding, the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex send a signal back to the limbic system that says, hey, shut up. It's just like when you look down at the ground and you see a snake and you jump, your limbic system's firing, and then you look down again, oh, it's a hose, right? Well, the message is sent back to the limbic system stops firing the fear response. You might have to catalyze and process some of the adrenaline that's been dumped into your system still. Your heart will race for another minute or two, but basically the limbic system stops sending the fear response. Well, there's a whole science behind, if you teach this stuff that I just went over with you to Walmart shoppers of the world, of which I'm one, you downregulate your negative stuff in real time. You can't help it. It's like a sneeze. And you turn off your limbic system. You get back your 10 to 20 IQ points of the amygdala hijack that can occur. So your prefrontal cortex keeps firing. You can think your way out of your problems. And there's a plastic effect over time that improves your life and increases your happiness, increases your well-being, increases your health, reduces heart rate, reduces blood pressure, yada, yada, yada. There's a whole like self-help play associated with all this stuff that I just showed you. So I'm kind of running with that, trying to help people. So that's the whole reason that you'll see me on the internet with a whole bunch of videos and playing this self-help role, because, I mean, there's a boatload of self-help in teaching this model to folks. It gives them back control of their mind. So it's not one of those things where, hey, I'm your guru, sign up forever, yada, yada, yada. It's like, let me give this tool to you so you can take your mind back. So that's basically what I'm doing. So there's a whole bunch of science that I connect with this as well in the book Mind Hacking Happiness. You can take a look at that. But basically all that to say, the science that I just presented to you is rock solid on emotions. And when we computationalize the whole, or computerize the whole model, Sophia will have Turing test passing emotions, and not in the far future, in the near future, because when you create the self map and the basic rule set to defend self, then you create the emotional response tree, action tree, based on the emotional responses that you can have, like what would she say or what would she do if she was pleased or angry or sad or fearful or nervous about something, and be able to then create Turing test reactions, verbal and visual reactions, that will freak people out and help serve the role of being that emissary, that go-between between human beings and our future artificial assistants that will run on this same type of technology. So anyway, I again apologize for the length of this video, but I hope that gives you an overview of the science of how Sophia can create artificial emotional intelligence for herself, and then also move down the path of being self-governing on how she develops as an individual, quote unquote. And again, this is kind of a major swipe from 50,000-foot view of how humans actually work, and it'll be a simulation for a while, but there at some point will become a line of fuzziness that once we open up the ability for the neural net to learn the processing and improve the processing a little bit, boy, then all bets may be off regarding the line between simulated consciousness and potential true consciousness. Although that's a discussion for a later time. I wrote a big article on how true consciousness may not be possible in silicon-based architectures. That went up on Science and Non-Duality a couple of months ago. And that was after a conversation that I had with the guy who invented microprocessors. I used to work for Silicon Graphics as a systems engineer, but this is long enough. I hope this finds you well. I hope this message of the model gives you the vision of how you can move forward and make Sophia emotionally intelligent in short order. in comparison to, you know, oh my God, it's a black hole of, you know, we can knock this out. This is not a problem. I hope everything is awesome for you guys. Ending the video. Talk to you soon.